everybody, it's Lavender Town, and today I wanted to teach you guys how I make a model sheet, or basically how I draw characters over and over consistently without them looking really weird. But first, a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Amino. Amino is an app where you can find groups of people into the stuff you're into. So obviously the anime art Amino is full of people who love to draw and appreciate anime art. A lot of you probably know this already, but I got into drawing through anime, so this is something very close to home for me. I found the whole community to be very warm and welcoming, and there's tons of stuff to do, lots of chats and polls and things to interact with. Speaking of things you should interact with, I actually just put up a watercolor I did recently exclusively up on Amino, so if you want to check that out, please click the link in the description. My name on Amino is Haley Musum, as you can see. Thank you to Amino for supporting my channel. Okay, so the inspiration for this video is basically that I've been noticing in my comic that my character, Planchette, goes off model quite a bit. Now, this is not an uncommon problem, and if you struggle with it, please don't feel bad, because it's seriously something that almost everybody has trouble with from one time or another, especially if you're working on animation or a comic. It's just natural that when you draw a character a lot, there's going to be small things that sort of change, and if you're not being cognizant of those things, it's going to happen more often than not. So one of the things I wanted to do first before I started this turnaround was to get some inspiration from some professional sources. Now, if you type in character sheet into Google, you're probably going to find a lot of just random artists posting their OCs, and while you can learn a lot from that, I find that if you search model sheet, you can find a lot of like Disney, Pixar, professional different artists who've done, you know, actual like production work, because it is the more formal name for what I'm looking for here. And that's, I mean, a model sheet is basically so you don't go off model in an animation. It's a really good example of how you can draw a simple turnaround, and it will make the end product of what you're trying to make significantly better. This is also why sometimes characters will go off model for an entire episode, because sometimes episodes are animated in different studios who have different model sheets. This can happen in modern shows as well as older shows, and it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, because they'll be consistent within this episode, but they'll be off model from other episodes, and it seems kind of strange that would happen in the first place. I just wonder why they don't send each other all the same model sheet. But anyway, the key things that you want to do when you're drawing this kind of turnaround is you want to make sure that you're doing enough different angles. Now, in the past, I've done turnarounds on this channel, and usually all I do is the front view, the side view, and the back view. And I really thought that that was good enough, but I'm starting to realize the importance of having those more subtle angles in here as well. So I'm going to try to do 2 bonus angles apart from my standard 3, because I think it will add a lot better understanding of the sort of Planchette in 3D space rather than thinking about her in 2D, and that is one of the best ways you can make your characters consistent. Thinking about them as a 3D shape that has actual, you know, weight and consequences in physics is a great way to make sure that they're not going off model. Other things that I try to consider is how their proportions sort of relate to each other. So one of the things that I've been doing ever since the start is trying to make sure that her sleeves are the same rough size as her actual like top. It just makes it so that it doesn't get like crazy off model, because I know that those things should be roughly the same size. And then some other things I try to do, I try to make sure that her skirt is the same width as the brim of her hat. One of the things I didn't have one of these sort of rough markers by how big or small it should be is her eyes and her other facial proportions, and that is one of the things I've had the most trouble with consequently. And you'll see me drawing a lot of different lines in between each of these drawings. Luckily, because we're in the sketch phase, we can do as many lines as we want. Every time I thought I could do it by eyeballing it, I quickly realized that it's just much better to draw a line. It's surprisingly hard to get things exactly where they need to be, and especially when you're doing these more subtle turns, things can look a little bit different. I found myself wanting to warp things towards the camera. It's just sort of a habit I've gotten into, and for a model sheet, that's definitely not something I wanted to be doing, so I found myself consistently correcting and trying to make sure that things were as in line as they possibly could be. There were a few places where I had a particular struggle trying to imagine them in 3D space. Her hat is one of those for sure for me, because I always want the hat to be separated away from the brim and visible. That's kind of a cartoon cheating out kind of thing that I often do. So I found myself pushing the tip of the hat away even when it would make sense for it to be touching the brim, or at least to appear to be touching or overlapping based on the angle. I wanted to sort of push it away just so that it would have a better silhouette. And you can do that. It just depends on if that's something you're willing to stylistically commit to or not. Because if that's not what you want to do in your animation or your comic, then it's not what you should do in your model sheet. I should also say, and I don't know if this is obvious or not, but just in case it's not, there are a lot of other things that you should draw alongside your model sheet when it comes to developing a character for some type of media. One of the things that I found the most interesting and fun when I was looking up sort of research on the professional versions of these is that there's a lot of sheets of just the characters making different faces, and I think that might actually be really helpful with the consistency as well, because characters having a signature angry face or a signature suspicious face or something like that is something that can really add a lot of life to them and also make them seem a lot more real. I think a lot of people in real life have specific faces that they fall into under similar emotional states or situations, and so it makes a lot of sense for your characters to also have those things. It'll also just make things a lot easier if you're searching for ways to make them emote. If you have a whole sheet of different faces that you wanted them to make in your story, you can always just cross-reference that and try to find the right expression for the job. Oftentimes I sort of realize that I'm giving my characters mannerisms without even meaning to. Certain characters just hold themselves a specific way, but if that's something that you struggle with, having a sheet to reference might really help you out, so definitely give it a try. When you're posing a character on your character sheet, I would say resist giving them a T-pose unless there's a really important reason for it. I think having them rest in a sort of normal, comfortable stance for what would fit their personality and how you expect to see them the most is probably the best, as long as it's not covering up too much of their design or their outfit. Obviously you want all of that to be seen as clearly as possible. So for example, on Planchette, I did try to have her arms set in a way where we can clearly see her sleeves and she's not deforming her skirt too much. I thought it suited her personality okay, but most importantly, it was a way for her to stand semi-comfortably without sort of morphing her outfit or covering up too much of it, which is obviously really important when you're making yourself reference images. And that's basically what this is. You're basically creating yourself reference images so that in the future of your comic or your book or whatever you're trying to make, that you have a little helping hand to keep you on model. You should also be careful though, if you're the type to lean more towards being a perfectionist rather than not. I would say you do have to be careful not to get too strict about your character staying on model. There's going to be some scenes where you have to push something a little bit or change something a little bit, and that's totally okay. If you make a big change that you want to keep, you can just add that to your model sheet and just try to keep it consistent from that point forward. For example, there's something that I've done with Planchette that at the start it really wasn't present. At the beginning of my design for her, I had her have very pale orange eyes. Now I liked this for a while, but I started to realize as the story continued and I added more complex backgrounds and things like that, I started to realize that she was getting really washed out, especially because she's the only character who only has a black and white dress of the main cast. So she was having trouble sort of popping with the other girls around her. So I decided to add a little more intensity, that I would add a bright red gradient over her orange eyes, and it became something that I really liked the look of. So rather than just being an experiment, I decided to make it part of her character colorization from now on. Now, I'm not to the coloring stage quite yet. The inking took forever, but you'll see in just a moment how I keep the colors consistent as well, because you do not want a mood ring character whose colors change constantly, unless that really is part of their character. That might actually be quite interesting, but if that's not canonically part of who they are, you want to keep things consistent on the color scale as well. But before I can even get into that, we've got to continue inking all of these different sides of Planchette. Now, I have the most difficulty with the profile, probably. I think for whatever reason, it was just looking really stiff and really strange. I was having a lot of trouble keeping everything where it belongs. Though once I did get her facial features figured out on her profile shot, I realized that this was one of the things that I needed the model sheet for the most. Planchette's face changes a lot in profile because I don't draw her in a straight up profile that often, so when I do, I'm pretty much always rusty at it. I'm really going to like having something to reference back on when I'm having trouble placing her mouth and her nose where it looks like it belongs. Sometimes you really just need to see the other angles of her face to realize where everything is supposed to go. Hopefully you'll find that with your characters as well, that it just helps clear some stuff up for you. It can be really hard to do all of this in your head, especially without any type of referencing that you've drawn previously. So if you take your time and be patient with yourself while you're making the model sheet, it'll probably save you a lot of time and trouble in the future. And don't get me wrong, I realize that this model sheet is not perfect. There are a lot of places where she sort of warped a little bit, but still it's a big improvement to trying to do this straight out of my head, even with the mistakes. I'm also going to show you in just a second how you can check for mistakes on this if you're having trouble telling if there's a problem, because obviously if this is something that you've been struggling with already, the actual drawing of the model sheet is also going to be hard, unfortunately. Like so many things in art, pretty much it's all difficult in one way or another. There were a lot of things that I had to continually keep editing and changing, especially her skirt. I really hadn't thought about the logistics of it. I always sort of pushed her skirt down a little bit so that she didn't look lewd or anything. I decided to give her bloomers from now on though, so I don't have to worry about that as much. And I did realize that her skirt should be sort of tilted up if it's tilted down the way it is in the front-facing picture, so I begrudgingly did that on the back angles where you can mostly just see her back. So here's a way to check to see how well your turnaround went. Basically just make a GIF with your character rotating. It's a pretty cool effect. I quite like how it looks, though it does reveal to me a few places where she's not quite right. But overall, it was close enough for me. I still feel like it's going to be really useful. So instead of doing any more edits at this point, I decided to get started on the color. So I highly recommend that you do some experimentation if this is the first time that you're really committing to a color palette for your character. Color palettes can be hugely helpful to make sure that your character looks the same even if you are having an off-model day. As long as they have the same color palette, you're probably going to get away with it relatively well. But if your colors are going off model, I guess you could still say, it's going to mess things up a lot and make it look a lot more sort of amateur, I guess. The way that I stay with the same colors always is, at least on Photoshop, I use this little plugin called Coloris or Coloris, and basically you can just drag down and make palettes out of any colors that you're using. Another way that you can do this in any program basically is just to have a tiny image of your character in previous panels or previous frames or whatever, and just eyedropper tool wherever you need to pick up the color. If you can, try to make swatches because it'll save you a lot of time rather than, eyedropping a JPEG every single time. And also be careful if you're using multiple different screens, make sure that your screen is color calibrated because that can mess you up as well and really confuse you. But that is the benefit of saving a swatch rather than doing it by eye, because even if you're on a really messed up monitor, you're going to keep it at least consistent. So that's basically the finished product. I'm still shading here and there in the footage, but I hope this was helpful to you guys. It's kind of a more straightforward tutorial video than I usually do. I just really wanted to make a model sheet for my character and hopefully teach you guys how you can do that for your characters as well. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Thank you to Amino for sponsoring the video. Definitely check out the link in the description, and I will see you guys in the next one. Good luck with all your character designs. Thank you to all of my patrons, including Bella Story, Kalpumpong, Clockwork Construct, Dionysus Hagarilis, Dr. Casket, Elizabeth Album, Hope Chilsum, Imagine Creations, JJJ, Joseph Kopel, Carla Tapia, Cat Did That, Cured, Making Claire, Midnight Doodles, Micah Dactyl, Nora Cornelison, Okamore, Ollie, Rose Espinoza, Rosie Warlock, Sergeant Pendulum, The Artsy Moose, Your Boy ST, and Zoe Stardust.